"He has already been born," a 4th-century bishop declared, and the sentence has haunted Christian imagination ever since. Who, then, is the Antichrist? For nearly 2,000 years that label has been hurled at emperors, heretics, popes, generals, revolutionaries, and, in our age, entrepreneurs and institutions. Today we will travel a counted path, 1 to 21, through those accusations, and ask a quieter question behind each name. What did the accusation tell people about their fears, their politics, and their theology? If you value historically grounded explorations like this, where theology, politics, and collective fear intersect, consider subscribing to the channel. We publish structured deep dives like this every day, following ideas across centuries rather than chasing headlines. Before we begin the list, a brief biblical grounding. The word Antichrist appears explicitly only in the letters of John, where it functions largely as a polemical category. Many antichrists are those who deny that Jesus is the Christ and who undermine apostolic teaching. Elsewhere, the New Testament offers related but distinct images that later readers blended into a single figure. The Gospels warn of pseudo-Christs or false messiahs. 2 Thessalonians speaks of a man of lawlessness obstructing truth and seating himself in God's temple. Revelation paints the beast and the dragon in apocalyptic colors. Historically, interpreters fused these strands, Johannine polemic, Thessalonian lawlessness, and Johannine visions, into the composite Antichrist, who looms as both doctrinal opponent and cosmic tyrant. That fusion is an interpretive move worth watching as we survey the accusations below. If this kind of church history detective work interests you, drop a comment with the name you think should top this list. Who would you pick as number 1 in a tradition of accusation? 1. Nero. 1st century CE, Roman emperor, rumored return. Linked to persecution of Christians. Nero's brutal suppression of early Christians, combined with later legends of his return, Nero Redivivus, made him an early template for apocalyptic evil. Some early Christian authors and later anti-Roman traditions read Nero's crimes through an apocalyptic lens, and by the time of the Book of Revelation, Nero's name and Nero-like imagery were available for interpreters who wanted a historical antagonist. This is a historically attested association rather than modern projection. Scholars often point to Nero as prototype for later Antichrist thinking. 2. Domitian. 1st century CE, Roman emperor, persecutor and imperial suspicion. Domitian's reign prompted some Christians to interpret imperial pressures as signs of eschatological antagonism. While evidence is patchier than for Nero, Domitian appears in early Christian polemics and later patristic commentary as a possible persecutor type whose rule resembled features expected of an end-time oppressor. This was a contemporaneous suspicion in some Christian circles, not a later conspiracy. 3. Decius. 3rd century CE, Roman emperor, signature persecutor of Christians. Decius's edicts that demanded public sacrifice forced Christians to make stark choices and generated apocalyptic readings of imperial authority. Accusations of antichristal tendencies attached to Decius come from the climate of persecution and the rhetoric of survival among believers. 4. Julian the Apostate. 4th century CE, Roman emperor, pagan revivalist charged with antichristal intent. Christians who saw Julian's attempts to restore pagan religion as a direct assault on the Christian order sometimes depicted him in starkly adversarial terms. The charge here is polemical and theological. Opponents cast Julian not merely as a political rival, but as theologically hostile in a way that resonated with apocalyptic expectation. 5. Arius. 4th century CE, Alexandrian presbyter. Doctrinal opponent labeled antichristal by defenders of Nicene orthodoxy. The controversy over Arianism did not typically cast Arius as the end-time Antichrist in the same way emperors were sometimes accused, but patristic rhetoric frequently employed Antichrist language to describe those who denied the full divinity of the Son. In short, this is closer to the Johannine usage. Antichrists as doctrinal enemies. 6. The Papacy. Medieval and Reformation eras. Institutional identification. The Papacy as Antichrist. From late medieval polemics through Protestant reformers like Luther and Calvin, the papacy was often named directly as antichristal. This identification has a long history rooted in both doctrinal disagreement, claims about authority and sacramental theology, and political conflict. It is predominantly a polemical reading, though massively influential in shaping Protestant eschatologies. 7. Particular medieval popes and anti-popes during the investiture controversy, 11th to 12th centuries, contested authority turned apocalyptic rhetoric. In the struggle over investiture, rival factions used apocalyptic labels against each other. Papal opponents and supporters sometimes charged rival claimants with embodying antichristal traits. These accusations were factional and polemical, rather than unanimous or doctrinal consensus. 8. The Jesuits, 16th to 18th centuries, targeted institution in anti-Jesuit polemic, often described in apocalyptic language. In confessional Europe, Jesuits were frequently cast in conspiratorial and antichristal terms by Protestant and even some Catholic critics fearful of their influence. This is an institutional accusation rooted in confessional conflict and propaganda. 9. Oliver Cromwell, 17th century English revolutionary leader, accused in Royalist and Anglican pamphlets. Cromwell's overthrow of the monarchy and religious reforms provoked strong apocalyptic rhetoric from his enemies, who labeled him an antichristal figure, intent on subverting the divinely ordered polity. These claims are well attested in contemporary polemical literature and reflect political demonization. 10. Robespierre and French revolutionary leaders, late 18th century. Revolutionary anti-clergy measures and radical social engineering made them targets for antichristal accusations. Clergy and conservative commentators often read the revolution's dechristianizing programs as evidence of an antichristal project. These are polemical charges embedded in a context of social and religious upheaval. 11. Napoleon Bonaparte, late 18th, early 19th centuries. Charismatic conqueror interpreted as prophetic villain by some clerical voices. Napoleon's attempt to reorganize Europe, his dealings with the Church, and his imperial self-presentation led various religious commentators to suspect him of playing an eschatological role. The accusation appears in pamphlets, sermons, and popular commentary of the period. 12. Pope Pius IX, mid-19th century, reactionary papacy, and the declaration of papal infallibility contributed to Protestant identifications of the Pope as Antichrist in some circles. This is a modern instance of the long papal as Antichrist tradition. The claim is polemical and significant within certain Protestant communities. 13. The Jesuit and Catholic conspiracy in early modern Europe, recurring trope across centuries, an ongoing set of accusations that sometimes used apocalyptic language to scandalize whole institutions. Note, this entry elaborates a recurring pattern rather than a single person. It is historically attested in pamphlet culture. 14. Communism and its leaders, Lenin, Stalin, 20th century, ideological radicality and state atheism prompted many Western Christians to name communism and its leaders as embodying antichrystal power. This was both an ideological categorization and, in some cases, a moral indictment of policies. The label functioned as a political and theological boundary marker during the Cold War. 15. Adolf Hitler, 20th century. Totalitarian brutality and genocidal policy prompted various religious leaders and popular commentators to name Hitler in antichrystal terms. These are widely attested contemporary accusations reflecting moral astonishment and a need to describe absolute evil. 16. Joseph Stalin, 20th century. Like other communist leaders, Stalin was envisioned by critics as an apocalyptic antagonist whose totalizing power and violent suppression of religion fit popular expectations of an end-time tyrant. The accusation was common in émigré, religious, and conservative circles. 17. Saddam Hussein, late 20th, early 21st century. Gulf War and post-Gulf War rhetoric included religious framings of Hussein as tyrant and, in some quarters, as an antichristal figure. This appears in evangelical commentary and wartime polemics. Scholars caution that such attributions were often rhetorical devices for mobilization. 18. Mikhail Gorbachev, late 20th century. A paradoxical suspect. Some commentators in the Cold War era cast Gorbachev either as liberator or as hidden danger. His name appears on lists and in commentary as an emblematic figure people projected apocalyptic hopes or fears onto. The inclusion here reflects the tendency to place contemporary leaders into eschatological narratives. It is a historical attestation of suspicion rather than academic consensus. 19. Bill Gates, 21st century. Internet conspiracies and vaccine skepticism sometimes elevate corporate or philanthropic figures into antichristal roles. Gates has been widely, if falsely, accused in conspiratorial online narratives that overlay modern technocratic anxieties onto biblical imagery. These are contemporary internet phenomena and should be read as social symptoms rather than scholarly positions. 20. Elon Musk, 21st century. A figure who appears frequently on social media lists and in memes that assign antichristal attributes to cultural influence, technological ambition, or perceived ideological power. Such attributions are popular and internet-driven. They are accusations circulating in the public square, not theological verdicts. 21. Global institutions and forums, e.g., global governance bodies cited on the Internet. 20th to 21st centuries. Organizations sometimes appear collectively as the target of apocalyptic suspicion. The United Nations, multinational economic bodies, or movements like the World Economic Forum get cast in antichristal terms by conspiracy communities. This is an institutionalized suspicion common in digital conspiracy cultures. Entries, 19 to 21. Added for title structure. Historically attested accusations appear in online and popular sources. As you move down this list, notice the patterns. Emperors and persecutors dominate ancient and early patristic suspicions. Doctrinal enemies dominate intra-church polemics. Institutional enemies, the papacy, Jesuits, and revolutionary leaders dominate early modern polemics. The modern and internet eras democratize the accusation, producing a sprawling menu of suspects from dictators to tech billionaires. Each choice tells us something about the accuser's anxieties. Over power, doctrine, identity, or the pace of social change. Two dynamics explain why the label Antichrist spreads so easily. First, political utility. Branding an opponent as Antichrist simplifies complex political and religious conflicts. If your rival is not merely mistaken or oppressive, but is the embodiment of cosmic evil, then ordinary political negotiation looks both insufficient and morally compromised. Acid hardening of politics into cosmic warfare is an older tactic than Christianity. Applied eschatology makes enemies legible and delegitimized. In many historical instances, from pamphlets railing against Cromwell to Protestant treatises against Rome, antichristal language functioned as rhetorical ammunition. That doesn't mean the accusation had no roots in genuine theological dispute, but it does mean the label was often pressed to serve partisan ends. Second, psychological and social sense-making. Apocalyptic frameworks promise meaning when institutions crumble, persecution intensifies, or unthinkable violence occurs. As historian Robert Fuller and others have shown, Apocalyptic thought helps communities place present suffering within a larger narrative arc that promises final vindication. That structure is psychologically consoling. It transforms contingency into destiny. But it also creates a strong bias toward reading immediacy into prophecy. People are most likely to point at contemporaries because doing so preserves urgency and motivates action. Now a few case studies that illustrate these dynamics more closely. Case Study A. Nero and the Nero redivivus motif. After Nero's death, rumors circulated that he had not truly died, but would return. For Christians who had experienced persecution under his reign, Nero became an archetype of imperial evil that could reappear in new forms. Revelation's beast imagery and later exegetical traditions sometimes used Nero as a historical anchor for fear. The case shows how concrete suffering, persecution, can harden into a recurring symbolic enemy. Nero becomes less a historical personality in memory than a template for any later tyrant. Case Study B. The Papacy in Reformation Polemics. When Luther and other reformers labeled the Pope or the papal system as Antichrist, they were doing several things at once: asserting doctrinal opposition, mobilizing political resistance, and responding to centuries of institutional tension over authority and sacrament. This identification reshaped Protestant identity for centuries. The papacy as Antichrist reading is one of the most consequential interpretive moves in church history, precisely because it fused theology, ecclesial self-definition, and political critique. Case Study C. Oliver Cromwell and Napoleon as political villains. Cromwell's revolutionary transformations and Napoleon's imperial reordering produced reactionary apocalyptic rhetoric. For contemporaries whose political world was being remade, calling a single man the Antichrist concentrated diffuse anxieties about modernizing regimes. Pamphlet culture and clerical sermons spread the charge. The label functioned to unify opposition and to sacralize resistance. Case Study D. The Internet Era and the Proliferation of Suspects. Gates, Musk, Global Institutions. The digital age has vastly reduced the gatekeeping of rumor. Social media and conspiracy networks make it easy to assemble lists of suspects, mix theological imagery with technological anxieties, and amplify fringe claims. The result is a democratized apocalyptic culture in which the Antichrist may be a CEO, a politician, or a transnational forum. These attributions are not theological conclusions, but social phenomena worth interpreting sociologically. Across these examples, some methodological cautions are essential. First, respect the Johannine nuance. Antichrists can be doctrinal categories. They can name many false teachers inside the community, not necessarily a single apocalyptic ruler. Second, remember interpretive fusion is historically contingent. The seamless Antichrist of popular imagination is the product of centuries of interpretive layering, not a single clear biblical portrait. Third, avoid modern proof texting. Using one verse to identify a contemporary leader as the definitive Antichrist collapses historical and exegetical complexity into polemic. What, then, should a thoughtful viewer take away? One practical takeaway: read accusations as sources about the accuser as much as about the accused. Who benefits when this person is labeled Antichrist? What social or political function does such rhetoric serve in a particular moment? Asking these questions helps diffuse the rhetorical power of the label. A second takeaway: engage biblical texts with attention to genre and context. Johannine polemic, pastoral admonition, apocalyptic vision. Each operates with different aims and images. Conflating them without explanation produces more heat than light. A third takeaway: practice charitable restraint in public speech. The history surveyed here shows the pastoral cost of demonizing opponents. Labeling living people with apocalyptic terms often escalates conflict and can undermine honest civic and religious deliberation. Finally, a reflective point. Accusations of Antichrist tell us about human need to narrate crises. Whether in Nero's time or on today's feeds, people seek explanations that confer meaning and offer hope of justice. The problem is not the human need itself, but the often destructive ways that need is satisfied when it is channeled into demonization. If you found this journey helpful, and if you want more historical surveys like this one, subscribe and click the related videos. Thank you for joining this counted journey from 1 to 21. May it sharpen curiosity, temper haste, and deepen the way you read both texts and the tumult of your times.